This podcast contains discussions on sexual misconduct. Topics such as sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment may be discussed. Listener discretion is advised. In this episode, I speak to Mirko Fernandez, victim advocate at the Global Fund.
They fear. Their fear is misunderstood. And so it's about giving them the space to express themselves. And then we're able to engage, and that's really important. And that's why I really like bystander approaches led by men, because they actually seek to talk to these men and try to ask them and try to find out, like, what is it that they fear?
This is the #NoExcuse podcast, discussing the challenges and complexities and potential solutions in preventing and responding to sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in the aid sector. Through interviews with victims and survivors, experts, aid workers, artists, and leaders. The podcast is produced by the World Health Organization's Department for the Prevention and Response to Sexual Misconduct. I am Guni Dias, your host and global focal point for the department. Mirko Fernandez, welcome to the #NoExcuse podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
So Mirko, as I look at over your career, a few powerful themes comes up. There's the prevention and response to sexual misconduct in the aid sector. There's championing human rights, working with the police forces, conducting investigations, and the most recently, advocating for victims. And as we prepared for this episode, so off camera, off audio, one thing that was clear to me is that you deeply care and you're very committed. So why is this work important to you?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I really appreciate that background. Yeah, I think, going back, I have to admit that there's been two significant events in my life that really kind of motivated me to go in this direction, inspired me to go in this direction, rather. When I was growing up, when I was young, my parents were Chilean exiles, and we lived in Canada after my parents left Chile for political reasons. And they were really committed to trying to expose the human rights violations that were happening at the time in Chile in the 70s due to the dictatorship at the time. And so my parents were really active, and some of the main issues that would come up would be torture, missing persons, enforced disappearances. And this really marked me growing up because I felt I felt that we were committed to trying to respond to that in some sort of way. This kind of gave me the motivation to have awareness of it, a social conscience. And I took that forward and I started to study, and I wanted to do something about it with my studies. So I got into forensic archaeology, anthropology, where we would use our skills in archaeology to try to help to identify and find human remains and try to bring some closure and hopefully some justice. And during that time when I was studying, I was working in a hotel, because as I found out that you can actually study sometimes during the off season when you're working in hotels. And I did that in downtown Vancouver. And in downtown Vancouver, where I went to school and I grew up, there was an area which was quite marginalized. It was in downtown core, and it was known as Skid Row. And unfortunately, you had a lot of people that were marginalized there that were suffering from addictions. Many of them were disproportionately from the Indigenous community. And often they would pass by and stay. And I got to know them because I essentially became part of the community. Then over time, the women would come in saying, have you seen so-and-so? They're missing. I'd be like, no, I haven't seen her for a while. Maybe I've seen her walk past outside the lobby door. And this continued for some time. And the people that went asking, so they went missing as well. And so he started kind of to see what was happening. And we started to find out that these women were missing. And that was really kind of impactful. And they were screaming for help in many cases. And I think as a society, we didn't really hear their calls. I think that motivated me to understand why these women were being chosen like this, or why were they being picked off, why were they being targeted. So that motivated me to try to understand from a gender perspective what was happening and how can I combine the forensic understanding of missing persons. And I naturally found my way into that field. And so that led me to start to work internationally, working with forensic teams trying to recover and identify missing persons as a result of armed conflict. And so that was really motivating for me. And one of the things I was really, I think that I remember was when then the movements would come out on raising that awareness of sexual violence. I really felt that these Indigenous women that went missing didn't get the same attention, and because they didn't fit this conception of beauty. And as a result, while they were screaming, "Me too, me too, I'm missing me too," we didn't really pay attention to them as a society, and that really that stuck with me. And so moving forward, I was able to start to work more on human rights, and eventually I moved away from forensic work and I started to work more on human rights, thanks to a degree in international human rights law. And I really started to focus on gender and policing and investigations. And so that's where kind of the story, the origins of where I am now today. And so these were really important marks. And I think one thing I come out that from that experience that comes away is that there's no gender equality without gender equity. And that today that stands by the work that I do.
One of the work you have done in the past that particularly interests me is your work with the UK police. Can you tell us a bit more about it? And are there any key learnings from that you carry with you as you do your work to advocate for victims?
Yeah, and that's another good question. Because now that's where I was after working as a forensic specialist. It was necessarily with the UK police, but it was more on the international level with different police organizations. And it was through UN Women. We developed the gender responsive policing line, and many of our experts had come from the UK. And so a lot of the work have influenced the work that we're trying to do and trying to embed policing competencies that were more gender sensitive, that would be more responsive to the needs of victim survivors of gender-based violence. And what I learned from that was essentially, that the police experts that we worked with were really motivated, both men and women, that became part of our expert core. And my job was to essentially amass this core of policing experts and try to channel their knowledge into a handbook for policing for the UN system. And a lot of the experiences came from the UK. And so that was what was interesting about them, working with them, was that their commitment to policing. They really cared about policing. They really wanted policing to change and to be a mechanism that brought justice protection to communities. And they knew that being gender sensitive was a crucial part of that. And so having male champions as kind of my colleagues was really inspiring. And so because again, they cared and they were really driven to try to embed bystander approaches where men would stand up and champion within the policing, which is very difficult because it's very patriarchal, it's very hierarchical, but yet they were willing to stand up. And working with organizations such as the International Association of Women Police, they were all champions. All these women had suffered all kinds of discrimination, moving up the ranks and being police officers, but they continued to be in that because they just really cared about policing and what they did. They would explain that we don't like, particularly the women police officers, that they didn't like quotas. They did, but what they wanted was just an equal playing field where the merits were based on the overall goals. And that was maybe community policing, intelligence policing, lead policing, where you needed to engage with the community. You needed to build partnerships. You needed to build rapport with the victim survivors. And this is what female officers did really, really well. And so the meritocracy of their ability to move forward and move up the ranks was really limited because it was based on more older models of what success was in policing, which didn't really reflect the community policing models that they wanted to. So they were trying to battle, not necessarily to get quotas, but just to make the playing field level because they really cared about policing and doing that. And so that I think for me was really important because it gave me the inspiration, and I saw that you can really care about what you do and ways of how you can make change. And they really fought for institutional change, embedding gender equality policies, gender equity policies within policing, but also they look to try to embed resilience, like whistleblower protections, bystander approaches, because they knew that it's just not about policies, but you also needed to have mechanisms, pillars of resilience. And they also wanted the hierarchy to be responsible and accountable. So all I did was just pretty much support them and just be in awe of what they did. And so as a result, I was able to learn a lot from them. And now taking this learning, I was able to apply it or try to apply it into different contexts.
What I'm hearing from you is amazing listening skills. And so that kind of leads me to my next question is that this area of work is predominantly led by women, be it the prevention and response to sexual misconduct. And as a man in this field, how does allyship looks like, practically speaking?
I think you have to realize as an ally that you have to find a common understanding of what success looks like when you want change. And you have to believe in gender equality in this case as well, like how gender equality is important for men and why is it so important for us. And because as men, we're poorly educated. And so in order to better educate ourselves, we need to understand why people are discriminated against rather than others, but also to be able to understand how we can work together to overcome these barriers. And so once we establish that, yes, this is important for both of us, we start to see the value in each other. So for me, it was seeing these women who, in policing, but it's not just policing, but also my other work, just women who stood up and were prepared to take risks, and they were willing to do that. And I found that really inspiring again. And so allyship means respect. You're able to put yourself in the position and to say, okay, like I see what you're putting on you, I see what you're risking in order to make something better. And so that empathy, that understanding, and that kind of respect, I think is a crucial part of the allyship, because you try to put yourself in that position. I can't put myself in the position of a woman because I have a different experience. But growing up as in a minority community, there's a lot of things I can comprehend with, and I can identify with. So we find our common ground and we try to work together. So I think that's really important. And the fact that women make space for me as well, that's good, and they encourage me. And most of my bosses, most of my line supervisors were all women in the work that I've done. So they took me under the wings, and I appreciate this as well. So this is really also important. So allyship, again, I think is about respecting and being able to put yourself in that position of them and the struggles, and try to find common ground so you can move forward again. Each person can bring the added value.
For those skeptics out there, what do you think is preventing men into allyship?
I think there's two different things, depends on the generation. So for example, when we worked with policing, when trying to change not the opinions, but the behavior of the senior leadership, we knew that they're from a different generation, and so the conversation was different. But when we worked with younger police, they may be aligned with gender equality. They may think, yeah, that's fine. I don't have a problem with my wife or my partner working. But what concerned them was having people who weren't there on merit, particularly women, who would take their jobs. So the discussion with this backlash is different according to the generations. And so it's not a very simple question, but I think it depends on many things. One is the society, the norms, the laws, and that's kind of the basics. But when you talk to men who are maybe doing a bit of backlash and they're younger, for example, you find you actually have a lot in common with them, and they fear. Their fear is misunderstood, and so it's about giving them the space to express themselves, and then we're able to engage, and that's really important. And that's why I really like bystander approaches, led by men, because they actually seek to talk to these men and try to ask them and try to find out, like, what is it that they fear? There's no fear. Like, imagine if we were able to explore ourselves in other means, like being a better father, more committed father, more time, and be able to share different experiences without having to feel like, I'll be less of a man.
So in the UN, we talk about a victim and survivor-centered approach. And sometimes it's a bit tricky to understand how it applies, practically speaking. And so I'm curious to know, in your current role, you are a victim advocate. Can you tell us and walk us through what it means to apply that? And can you walk us through the process and the potential friction in adopting a victim and survivor-centered approach?
Yeah, and this is always an issue. And I want to highlight the differences between what I've seen in modern policing where I believe that they're more advanced than we are in the administrative investigation world. I believe that they're really in policing, particularly in countries like the UK, the US, Canada, Australia, and in Europe, they're really trying to find ways to embed better practices so you're trauma-informed. Because normally in cases, when it comes to the work that we do, and it's very gender-based and power-based of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, you often get the case of it's my word against their word. And so the only way that the playing field is level is if there's a trauma-informed approach and allowing the victim survivor to be able to express themselves in a way that they feel comfortable and without fear, without judgment. And only when that is embedded, then can the playing field is level for them to actually have an equal opportunity to participate meaningfully in this process. If not, it's generally you have to prove that this allegation took place, and it's your word against this person who is maybe a director or someone of power, someone of authority, who has a reputation as a human rights defender. So it's very difficult, and you feel very powerless. So this is one of the main issues. How can we level the playing field so that, in fact, it is the victim survivor has an equal opportunity to access remedies? What tends to happen is that we're notified that we have a victim survivor. We have a person that we can contact, and we reach out immediately. We try to build rapport. We try to find a way to let them know that we're there for them.
When we say a victim, we are talking about a victim that has reported in the channels of reporting within an organization.
Yeah.
And so this victim can be part of the community, or victims or survivor could also be part of the organization.
Yes.
So if we go back into your role, the victim or survivor reports, it goes into the organization. Mm-hmm. There's an investigation body that picks it up. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then what happens?
So then once the complaint gets in, there's an intake process where they review it's like a preliminary review of the facts and the information that they have. And they try to determine the status of the victim survivor, whether or not they're a beneficiary of our grants. Then, depending on that, they'll determine the course of the investigation. But for us, it remains the same. If they're a victim survivor, it's the same approach. Doesn't matter the course, we still support them. For us, it doesn't matter.
When you say us, you mean as a victim advocate?
Yes, exactly. For us as victims advocate, it doesn't matter the course of the investigation. We work independently. What for us is the most important is their well-being in the process, and that they feel emotionally, physically, and psychologically prepared to participate in the investigation process. So that's our role. So then we build a rapport. We try to identify with them what their immediate needs are and how best we can address them. So that way they feel they have a platform to be able to represent themselves. And so in doing so, what I've realized is that when you reinforce their agency, by trying to make sure that they have the support needed, but also to remind them that they are standing up for themselves. And that matters a lot for them, because often they feel that they're not, and they haven't, and they didn't at that time. But to feel that, in fact, that they did stand up for themselves, and it's recognized, and that their agency and their courage is recognized, that really goes a long way. And they value that a lot when somebody else says that to them. Now, where we tend to have problems or friction or just challenges is when the investigators want to be as impartial as possible. They don't, and for good reason. That's part of the work. So they're trying to walk a thin line between being victim-centered, yet ensuring that due process is respected. Often the case, we have principles such as being victim-centered, time-effective, do no harm, confidentiality, but these are very difficult to actually implement in practice. And so when you have a victim survivor that has looking at you and say, okay, well, how do I know this person's not going to retaliate? Right? There's other things we cannot guarantee. We simply can't. So we have to be able to be very clear with them and explain to them what we can and cannot do. Yet, and with that information, hope that they'll continue to work with us. Sometimes they feel that, no, this is okay. I don't want to participate more. And that's okay. That's what they want. But if they do want to continue the process, it's important that they feel that they have made informed decisions and that as a result, they're able to participate meaningfully in the process. And so what we try to do is that we try to make sure that the investigators are also aware of perhaps maybe if we know that they're going through a difficult time, trauma, we try to identify and share information. So, look, they're going through a bit of a difficult time. It's not easy. Perhaps they've been out of work. So they're struggling. There's other things they have as priority. Let's try to find a way so when you have an interview with them or we engage them, that it's as comforting as possible, considering the challenges that they're facing. And so that's what we try to do. And this is not so much, this is not so easy because we work on principles and these principles are not easy to implement. We cannot guarantee confidentiality. It's absolute confidentiality is almost impossible. So we have to try to inform them that we'll do the best we can with information we have to make sure that we maintain the information you share with us responsibly. Other challenges are knowing the scope of our work. Sometimes victims, they rely on us for other things. Just because we're there, they need someone to speak with. We might be the only person that's actually giving them that space. So if they're going through a difficult moment, they'll express that to us. And so we also have to make sure that there's limits and that they understand our scope. But what I find, again, is once they're able to get clear information and they get updates, and that's really important for them, updates, and they feel that they're respected and they have support along the way, they're quite willing to participate. And they feel eager. They feel they want their voice to be heard. They may not necessarily at the end expect to have full remedy, but the fact that they've been given that platform to express themselves and to share what happened to them, and that the events that took place, the perception of it is being recognized, that goes a long way. And I find that when victim survivors are supported, their resilience in the process is quite high.
Yeah, because it does require a lot of courage to go through a process like this. And I understand. So you're saying having a victim advocate really supports them in this process. So you are that person they will go to, right? When they are doubting themselves or they feel like, they might pull out and they said, no, this is not for me.
Yeah, happens all the time.
Yeah. Why?
Yeah, it's just because they feel that the process is taxing on them emotionally. And they have other things to worry about. They have maybe they have to find work, they have a family they have to take care of. You see this a lot, particularly with women, is that they put the needs of others before them. And so what we try to do is respect that, but also make sure that they look after themselves. And so that's always a challenge, because we understand that yet they have perhaps children to feed or relatives to look after, but we remind them that they are important as well and that they need to be also looking after themselves. And we're there to help them with that process while they're in this investigation process. That's really important too. They're very unselfish.
This victim drops out. What happens with the investigation?
That depends on how far they moved with the investigation. Mm-hmm. The investigation can continue forward. However, of course, if the victim survivor doesn't participate, you're missing a crucial part of the information. So maybe perhaps through other means, they can substantiate the allegations, but without their participation, they tend to go unsubstantiated. But perhaps maybe that's what the victim survivor wants. They just want a message to be sent to that person that, hey, you weren't just able to do this easily, that perhaps maybe I did not continue with it, but it's a message to you that you've been watched, or the event has been recognized in some sort of form. And that's also important as well. It all depends on the victim survivor, how they view success in this process. And that's up to them. They tell us what a victim survivor approach is, and then they tell us what success looks like for them.
Wow. Yeah. What success looks like for them. I guess it evolves over time, over the process, right? The beginning, they might have a certain understanding or hope, and then it kind of changes.
Yeah. But we're with them through that process. They're not alone. We accompany them through that process.
So your work really undoubtedly demands a lot, be it emotionally, I think also physically, because you are basically hearing these victims and survivors, supporting them. And I think it often, you're put in a situation where you have to put their needs first. And more on a practitioner standpoint, someone who does a work that is similar to yours. Yeah. How do you manage to take care of yourself within all of this happening, where it kind of, this is your day job? And what are some of the practices that you've been applying so that, you know, you stay resilient in an environment that can, you know, that can be actually quite challenging to maneuver?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. We absorb a lot of emotion. We absorb a lot of, I don't say suffering, but just challenges faced by people. And at the same time, we have our own challenges at home. We have the challenges at work. And so, yeah, we have to manage a lot. We have to make sure that we're emotionally stable or emotionally healthy when we reach out to our victim survivors. So we always try to, or I do at least, try to make sure that I'm in a good position to be able to respond and help and always be in communication with them, because they really count on every word. The victim survivors, it's really important what you say, and they really analyze the information you send them and the rapport. So you have to always feel that you're in a good place when you support them. In many cases, you're a resource person, and even though you absorb a lot of emotion, but you also see how they're willing to cooperate with you, and you start to problem solve, you start to look for solutions. Let's make this happen. And so you're just energized and motivated to open doors for them as much as possible. And then they go through the doors. They're the ones who go through the doors. They're the ones who make things happen. And so that helps out a lot when you have a clear distinguishing of roles and you know your place in this process. And so that helps. But also, I think it's really important to have a healthy place. For example, in your outside, your personal life has to be healthy. I think we have to find that balance. If you feel that both places are being somehow compromised and your emotional, psychological health is on both ends burning, I think that's time to step out. And I think it's okay that you can speak to your managers, you can speak to your colleagues, saying, look, the wick is burning at both ends. I need to step back. And that's why we have two in our case, well, myself and my colleague Leah. So we support each other, and that's really important. But also, I think it's really important to be able to do things like exercise where you're not thinking about work, and really work your 8 hours and not try to overwork yourself, and have activities that are for you. For example, what I like to do now is I'm now really into different dances, for example, salsa and bachatas, but I've been dancing tango for about 13 years now. And that really helps because you don't think about, you're thinking about the music and you're thinking about your dance partner. And so that always really helps. It just, there's no space for work. It's just, that's kind of your moment. And that's really, that helps a lot.
Moment.
And that's really important.
Did it ever happen to you where you noticed that you were slipping off? What are some of the signs where, you can see, okay, I do need a break?
Yeah, that's a good question. So back in my early days when I was working on enforced disappearances and missing persons, we would, in Guatemala, I remember particularly, we would go to the rural areas in the mountains, and we would try to find missing persons from 20 years ago, which was very difficult because the landscape had changed. And the families would accompany us, and they would bring food for us just to make sure that we would try do our best to find their missing relative. And we would spend days up there, and sometimes we didn't find them. But yet they would come every day with walking 2 kilometers or 1 kilometer to bring food and water for us. It was really, touching. We were able to have psychosocial experts that accompanied us, and they were really important because they facilitated the consultation process. And so they made sure that the families were feeling that they could participate in a healthy way, that they accompanied them through the process. And I remember during one exhumation, it was really sad because we couldn't find the relative. And the psychosocial expert who I remember, Susanna, she said to me, because they brought food also, and chickens and animals. And she saw that maybe I was looking at the animals and kind of feeling a bit sad. She said, as soon as you start to feel that you're projecting trauma onto these animals or anything else, then it's an indicator that you maybe need to step back, that you're perhaps now suffering a bit of secondary trauma or vicarious trauma. And perhaps that's a moment to step back. And so I remember that since from 20 years ago of her saying that. So whenever I feel I'm projecting any trauma on just say a cat or a dog on the street, and I've been deep in it in my work, then I know it's a needed time to step back. And it's an indicator for me just to find a way, speak to my colleagues. And, I don't have a problem speaking with it. I think it's important to be able to have channels to be able to release. And that's what I've done. And definitely the dancing helps a lot, for sure.
It requires a lot of self-awareness, isn't it? Thank you so much, Mirko, for being so vulnerable, open, and for caring so much for victims, because and being a man in this field, because we need more people like you. So
no, thank you for the opportunity, thank you for the space, but also I'm just a product of people who believed in me and took me aside, and so that's I'm just that, and thanks again for everything.
Thank you for listening. If you have any feedback or questions, feel free to reach out to us to prseah@who.int. Until the next time, goodbye.